Hey, nice to see you. Thank you very much. Oh, there's some reverberation with the microphone, but yeah, perfect. Well, it's really, really nice to see you all. Thank you for being here again tonight for Salon number 49. 50 is coming, and it's going to be a big one, yes. And here is also Christina. And tonight, experiment we're going to present together. So I think this is also a first, even though you know Christina already very well. So for those of you who are here for the first time, my name is Paola Antonelli. This is Christina Mouchot. I am here at the Museum of Modern Art as both a curator of architecture and design and director of R&D, and Christina is the R&D associate. The R&D department tries to prove to the world that museums can be the R&D of society. That's our reason to exist. And that's why you're here, because you are the guinea pigs of this R&D. Now, seriously speaking, it's nice to see you all here. And for those of you who are in the overflow room, please feel free. I'm going to give you my email address. Please send questions afterwards. It's paola_antonelli@moma.org. So feel free to send emails during the Q&A section. So as you know, the topics from the salons come from the real world. Don't we need some lightness right now? You know, we really do. But as Milan Kundera, who is one of the heroes of tonight, together with Italo Calvino, knows very well, sometimes lightness comes as a burden. So we will talk about that particular dichotomy, and you see here we start with one of his first quotes from the Unbearable Lightness of Being, the famous novel that he wrote in 1984, which is set in Prague during the Prague Spring in 1968, which talks about this kind of like back and forth that we have between wanting to have lightness, but at the same time finding lightness burdensome, especially if it gives this sense of inconsistency and of unweightedness to life. So where does light and lightness begin, and where does heaviness begin? What is the term of paragon? You know, that's what we will discuss. It used to be the human body, it used to be the human psyche, but right now we've been augmented and shrunk so many times that sometimes we don't even know it anymore. So Kundera talks about the fact that if one lives only one life, we have no comparison with lives before, and we don't know which decisions are better and which ones lead to lightness or to heaviness. Our lives are freed from significance, giving them lightness, but also making them unbearable in our knowing that they are meaningless. So the idea of both psychological and physical lightness or heaviness is what we're going to discuss today. And what you see in the background is a basic house, is a house for unhoused people by Martin Azua that he designed in 1999 that is part of the collection, and that talks about the fact that a home is a shelter, but it's also a kind of envelope. And it's kind of interesting to talk about it today because he thought that by talking about this home that can be put in your pocket, you can carry your home with you. It's this idea of freedom and lightness and possibility. But at the same time, we're going around New York where there are so many unhoused people right now. And the whole symbol of the house in itself is also conveying tremendous heaviness for us. So having it all, it's having freedom, but also not having the burden of that so-called freedom being actually forced upon you by the circumstances. So it really is interesting to see the house as, together with other elements, as central to tonight's conversation. So let's go to Bucky Fuller. You know, really, how much does your house weigh? You know, he was talking about it, you know, this kind of central figure in American culture and also in architecture and design, which is where actually we come from, Christina and I come from. How much does your house weigh was the question that he wanted to pose with his prefabricated houses in 1929, in the 1920s, the Dymaxion house. And he was saying that each additional pound of material requires more energy and resources to manufacture, transport, and assemble, not to mention to heat, cool, clean, and maintain after construction. So he was about taking away as much as possible, leaving what are the essential elements of the home and instead cutting away all the fat. which is, of course, the opposite of a Mac mansion. You see here from macmansionheld.com, which is run by Kate Wagner, one of the examples of these dwellings that are totally the opposite. So the home, not only as a building, but also as an entity, can be also a place of heaviness and lightness. This is an exhibition that happened at MoMA in the 1980s that was called The Pleasures and Terrors of Domestic Living. It was like really an amazingly important show. And it talked about domestic life in the 1980s. It was talking about the domestic realm as a place where many issues coalesce, as all of us know. You know, think about the warmth and the importance and how much a family that is supportive frees you. And also think of Betty Friedan. You know, so it's really quite fascinating to see that these kind of dichotomies also happen within the confines of the home. Not to mention this idea of really dropping all the fat. I'm sure that you've seen what happened with Kanye West Tadao Ando building that he bought on Malibu. Has anybody read the amazing, okay, so some people, just to tell you, for the people that haven't read it, there is this construction worker that was hired by Kanye West to basically get rid of all the trappings of domesticity of this building that Tadao Ando had built in Malibu, on Malibu Road, in the, I think it was about 10 years ago. So basically, the building now is there rotting after it's been depleted of all its windows, bathrooms, kitchen, chimneys, everything, because Kanye West wanted to be light. He actually told Mr. Saxon, Tony Saxon, this construction worker, let's go, simple, fresh, and clean. So really, that's how he talked about it. So he really went all the way with this idea of the domestic ghost. Oh, we both clicked. Mm-hmm. No.
Hello? Okay, now it's working. Okay. So humans living in permanent settlements is actually fairly recent in our history. About 12,000 years ago did we make the transition from a more nomadic lifestyle to one of more permanence. And what this meant was that lightness was no longer a prerequisite. So when we were carrying everything that we owned, every pound meant more energy to be expended from our bodies or from the bodies of the animals that we then had to care for. So across times and cultures, we've developed various methods of carrying things that respond to the anatomy of the human body, whether it be carrying things upon our head and neck, on our backs, with our arms, or across our shoulders. Fast forward to today, we've outsourced much of that energy to engines and primarily fossil fuels. As Alan Sekula has showed us in his wonderful project Fish Story, in which over the course of 7 years, he visited various port cities around the world, he makes really apparent to us the kind of materiality of global capital. And we also can begin to think about the huge discrepancy between the capacities of the human body, both physically and also mentally, to kind of comprehend the huge scale with which we're now moving goods around the world. So this is the MSC Irina, which has the capacity of 24,000 TEU, which that roughly corresponds to the amount of containers. So we had to invent a sort of new system of measurement to begin to even understand the scales in which we are now operating. And this is in service of primarily two things, convenience and comfort. So in order to have things brought to essentially our doorstep or right around the corner in packaged, convenient to eat and use containers, it relies upon this heavy and very weighted system. And these kinds of systems become apparent to us only in moments in which it starts to collapse. So we all remember in March of 2021, when the Ever Given cargo ship got trapped or stuck in the Suez Canal, and it brought this sort of global shipping infrastructure to its knees. And in these moments, it's when the illusion of comfort and convenience kind of comes crumbling down.
Yeah, convenience and comfort will be the death of us. That's what we all try to achieve, but at the same time, with sacrifices for others and for the rest of the planet that sometimes remain invisible to us. And that's what technology truly has done. It has enabled us to transport goods all over the world. And also it has enabled us to transport information all over the world. And all that seems to be completely weightless and completely invisible, but in truth, it comes at a tremendous physical cost of extraction in the environment. So you see here two maps. One is the map that tracks the world's ships in real time. It's fascinating. It's kind of Flight Radar 24 for ships. And the other instead is the one of submarine cables that are the ones that enable us to have information, to also carry the burden of what happens in other parts of the world, but in reality think that we're not carrying any burden. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see this beautiful piece on the second floor of MoMA. It's still there in a gallery called Systems. It's the Anatomy of an AI System by Kate Crawford and Vlad Anjoler. It tracks all the systems of extraction of data, of labor, and of materials that are behind an Amazon echo, giving an actual physical X-ray of what might seem to be almost immaterial. And you see here also, I told you that Italo Calvino would come next. It's interesting to see what he was able to have an intuition of before this was even possible. Then we have computer science. It is true that software cannot exercise its powers of lightness except through the weight of hardware. I mean, such a great mind to understand all that before our awareness of today. The iron machines still exist, but they obey the orders of weightless bits. So this back and forth between weightlessness and heaviness is immutable and can be recognized across times. And we can see it here. It's about the invisibility of weight that gives us the illusion of getting away with it, but in truth, hell will have to be paid.
So this is the Crystal Palace, designed by architect Owen Jones for the first great exhibition in London in 1851. And here, this is the largest scale up until that time that steel and glass were deployed. And yet he, in his guide to the building, had stated that he wishes to, quote, annihilate the structure. And he did that by actually going in and hand painting each cast iron element to reflect the spectrum of kind of daylight colors. So in that way, the building becomes an instrument for creating feelings of atmosphere. So in that sense, the building, despite its sort of heaviness and weightedness, was meant to sort of disappear and become one with kind of the atmosphere. Following that, this kind of captured this notion in which architects had this desire to sort of liberate buildings from the ground and also from their materiality. So if we move forward a little bit to architectural modernism, we arrive at Le Corbusier. At the time, architects became sort of infatuated with the use of aircrafts because in the one sense, it allowed them for the first time to see the urban environment from above, but it also meant that they could look up and see these astounding technological machines flying through the air and desired that to be of their buildings as well. So here we see Le Corbusier with the use of pilotis to sort of elevate the main structure of the building. But what's interesting here is the sort of metaphor of the airplane and how far that can take us, because in a sense, although the airplane is able to liberate itself from the surface of the earth, it always must return. It depends upon the earth for its fuel, for its food, for its water, for many other things. So if we continue on and we look, for example, at an architect such as Buckminster Fuller, we depart from the analogy of the airplane and we think instead about this idea of the spaceship. So he used to talk about this notion of spaceship Earth, describing the Earth itself as a spaceship with a finite number of resources and emphasizing the need to work collectively rather than working individually to kind of create this system of sustaining our sort of existence. And that is even exemplified in sort of his structural design. So here we have a geodesic dome, which works by distributing load evenly across all of these rigid triangular structures. And he exemplifies some of these ideas with his notion of ephemeralization, which is essentially the concept of doing more and more with less and less until eventually you can do everything with nothing.
And indeed, shrinking, diminishing, doing less, consuming less energy is a notion that we have been discussing for a really long time. The Incredible Shrinking Man is not only a wonderful B movie, it's also a theory by this Dutch designer, Arne Hendricks, from 2001. He worked on it for several years, and he calculated, it's a big website if you want to visit it, he calculated, for instance, that if we were only 50 centimeters high, we would use about 2% of the resources, if we were all that high, 2% of the resources that we all use. And of course, the idea of a shrinking economy, one should always be growing, right? I don't know if you've read that article that was in the New York Times recently, and of course there's the donut economic model. And so post-growth is an approach. The donut economy is a tool, the idea that the planetary envelope is what contains the social envelope, and we have to fit within it, so not try to elbow it. And the circular economy is a business model. So if you see, there are all these different strategies that we can have that are about degrowth, or at least trying to contain the continual growth. Shrinking also makes us think of the dark side of lightness, and that's what comes with, for instance, eating disorders. I don't know how many of you here have had eating disorders, but the relationship between lightness and energy when it comes to the body is incredibly interesting. I had anorexia. The energy that you have when you're anorexic is almost like superhuman, right? And the same happens with the theories that say that if they've been tested with mice, but at the point of starvation, you have actually much better chances of survival. So it is fascinating to see how this particular aesthetics of lightness has undertones that then become also racial. It's very complex, and you'll hear somebody from our videos talk about that. And it's interesting to see how we thought that we had overcome all that. We thought we were in the age of body positivity, and instead here comes Ozempic, and we're back to that idea of lightness, and people are actually companies are actually changing the sizing and the way they provide clothes because so many people are shrinking because they're taking Ozempic. So it's really quite fascinating to see that we have not gotten beyond that particular stigma yet. And Christina and I were thinking, who's the perfect symbol of lightness? And it's Muhammad Ali, that sting like a bee and fly like a butterfly, float like a butterfly. And there's another quote by Calvino quoting Paul Valéry that is beautiful. So he says, lightness for me is related to precision and definition, not to the hazy and haphazard. Paul Valéry said, one must be light like the bird, not like the feather. And it's such an important idea and note to have. So Italo Calvino wrote a beautiful review of the unbearable lightness of being. And he was talking about the fact that Kundera thought that the weight of living is found in all types of restriction. But at the same time, those restrictions are the ones that give meaning and ballast and groundedness to our life. And that's a very design. I reveal here my design curator essence. It's a very design attitude, that of having a ballast and having limits in order to then have meaning. Calvino wrote the 6 memos for the next millennium because he was about to give some lectures at, I think, at Harvard, the Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. And he died before delivering them, but he wrote all the first 5 points: lightness, quickness, exactitude, visibility, multiplicity. He didn't get to write the consistency one, which I find really interesting, but he remains really a master of the concept of lightness. And we want to end here with the idea of the individual versus the social, individual lightness versus the weight of society, and how we must bear responsibility in order to be human beings. So how do we approach the gravity of the current situation? And is it our burden to bear? And whose responsibility is it? And tents that are so portable, that symbolize the way we used to live, we used to live many, many centuries ago, have become the object, the symbol that shapes entire countries, right? So it's interesting to think about how there is this lightness and heaviness, and how we must try to really keep them in balance and understand our responsibility towards society. And tonight, to talk about all this and more, we have 6 wonderful individuals. We start with Harriet Etplau. You have all of their descriptions, but she's a space architect. And we have Sonam Kachru, who is a professor of religious studies in Yale and an expert in pre-modern Buddhist and Indian philosophy. Shannon Mattern, who's a media theorist and is at UPenn, and then Sarah Oppenheimer, who's an architectural manipulator. They like to be called that way. Sorry for the pronoun. They like to be called that way. And then Glaucio Paulino, who's a professor of civil and environmental engineering in Princeton, at Princeton University, and last but not least, Insoo Suh, who is the director of minimally invasive endocrine surgery at NYU. And we're going to also have, of course, several videos by, it's going to be a dense night. So I don't know how much Q&A there will be, but we'll introduce them as we go. And we're going to start actually with the first video that is by Ed Van Hinte, who is actually the person that gave us, many years ago, gave me the idea of lightness because he wrote several books on it, and also has become almost a guru for us in this salon. So please, let's start with the first video by Ed, and then a second video by Nathan Sire, and then it'll be Shannon's turn.
There is no animosity. Convenience simply ignores lightness. Convenience used to imply lightness when we had to carry everything ourselves, being nomads. Then we discovered external energy sources, the turning point. Animals, wind, elasticity, fire, electricity. You know it. Mass convenience. We produce billions of cars, and a car is an empty luxury carriage 20 times its payload with an overstated speed potential. Speed convenience. An airplane is a clumsy time machine, fast and wasteful. Information convenience. It craves hardware and energy. Artificial intelligence steals irony. Convenience comes with negligence. We must unplug things instinctively. Please turn me off.
According to the Global Footprint Network, humans use as much ecological resources as if we lived on 1.71 Earths. We've been using more than 1 Earth of resources every year since 1971. Yet here we are 53 years later, still growing more people, more food, more cities, year upon year. The concept of carrying capacity was born in the 1840s to express the volume of cargo that a steamship could carry. Unlike sailing vessels, whose holds could be filled entirely with cargo, steam power required a lot of space below decks for boilers, engines, coal, and fresh water. This mattered because tariffs were levied on the overall volume of a ship as calculated from its exterior dimensions. This worked with sailing ships, but proponents of steam shipping, which is to say the British, did not wish to pay tariffs on the portion of their ships that could not be used for cargo. Carrying capacities have been calculated for all sorts of things since the age of steam. In ecology, wildlife management, chemistry, medicine, economics, anthropology, transportation and tourism, engineering, demography, and population biology. After a period of exuberant use, most of these fields have discarded carrying capacity as circular, non-existent, or incoherent. Yet it persists. Carrying capacity appears to refer to relations in the actual world, lending an appearance of objectivity, rationality, and precision. 1.71 Earths. That the concept of carrying capacity has limits does not mean that the limits it purports to specify are non-existent or meaningless. Far from it. The point, rather, is that such limits are rarely static or quantifiable, let alone predictable and controllable. One can liken the world to a ship, but that does not make the world like a ship.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much to Paola and Christina for inviting me, and your introduction so beautifully foreshadowed, which itself is a really lovely light metaphor, a lot of what I'm going to talk about. So, a few weeks ago, I published an article on the social history of cardboard boxes, a seemingly light apparatus that's produced through a resource-intensive process with a significant carbon imprint, our footprint that is, which then links us to vast, heavy global logistical infrastructures. It was this piece that prompted Paola and Christina to invite me to join you this evening. I started my research for this project about 4 years ago, then had to set it aside. I remember sharing some preliminary thoughts in a symposium at NYU on March 4th, 2020. It was the last in-person event I'd attend for roughly 2 years. The heavy burdens of that tumultuous period, an early pandemic period, precluded the fieldwork and archive visits I need to complete the project. But our state of exception also, coincidentally, added new weight to what was once a relatively light interest, rooted mostly in my interest in graphic design. Boxes became our conduits to sustenance, our tethers to one another. And in my article, I was now able to demonstrate not only how the light, humble cardboard box brings the supply chain to our doorsteps and shapes our global imaginations, but also how it embodies capitalism's faults and ruins, how it itself becomes a very light domicile, to harken back to some of the introductory comments, and how despite its lightness, it transforms the very landscapes it traverses. Most of my research is about how information is made material in the world, through everything from interface designs to library architectures to urban communication infrastructures. I often examine how seemingly light conceptual architectures are concretized and made weighty. Cardboard boxes are one example of a medium into which we collapse multi-scalar information architectures, personal addresses, zip codes, logistical landscapes, economic geographies. So I want to use my remaining time this evening to give some weight to a few more media forms and communication technologies prized for their ostensible lightness. First, let's think about compression, whether it's transforming raw audio into a lighter MP3 file or combining a variety of tools into a single, lighter, multi-purpose gadget. The poetics and ethics of such lightening were the subject of heavy debate last month. I'll share the offending example here, but I should first issue a content warning. This might weigh heavily on your artist and designer hearts. So the collapsing and integrating of gadgets is nothing new, but the violence we see here, the fact that it frames the very embodiment of these analog instruments as their weakness, the disregard for any craft inherent in those instruments' production, and the force with which lightning is imposed, clearly rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. What's more, these long-standing aspirations for miniaturization and compression have new resonance in the AI era. As artist and researcher Eric Silvaggio writes, quote, "The ad is a perfect metaphor for the generative AI training process. Squish it all into a model. All that stuff becomes one interface. It's a reductive AI frame again, one in which human experience is fodder for products." Not only are such promises of lightness an epistemological and aesthetic affront, they're also materially misleading, if not downright deceptive. The lightness and unfetteredness of wireless technology has merely displaced its wires elsewhere, as Paola mentioned earlier. Even those shrinking cell phones exert a rather heavy footprint in both their manufacture and their disposal. So-called artificial intelligence requires the exploitation of vast natural and human resources. We might wonder if it's possible to program or manufacture digital technologies that have a lighter touch on their users and the material world. Making gadgets more readily upgradable and repairable is one strategy. I wrote about such efforts in a recent piece on the history of the repair manual just a couple months ago. Engineers and developers have sought to implement lighter, more flexible workflows, as evidenced in euphemisms like agile development. But as media scholar Miriam Posner notes, agility turns development into an assemblage of light parts, which can keep anyone from having a macro-scale view of or being willing to take responsibility for the process as a whole. Lightweight software, meanwhile, is designed to be light in its execution, with minimal software bloat and low usage of system resources. Similarly, permacomputing draws inspiration from permaculture in aiming to create technologies that are in good relation with the earth, technologies that are small, flexible, compatible, efficient, and resilient. And rather than taking the need for heavy computation as a given and then designing to mitigate its deleterious heavy effects, something called minimal computing, practitioners of what's called minimal computing, prioritize the use of minimalist content management systems, lightweight, energy-friendly design features and hosting services, accessibility, and inclusivity. Those latter factors prompt further questions about how to protect people's privacy and security. What might it mean to not collect any data at all or minimize the need for complex computational processes? Let things be light, ephemeral, analog. Let things be deleted and decay. This past weekend, I went to the East Village Zine Fair, where I saw lots of lightweight analog things fluttering in the wind. People had to put stones on them to keep them from flying away. So many tiny publications with weighty, radical messages about solidarity, bodily autonomy, fugitive histories, about Palestine and divestment, which made me think of another set of lightweight media carrying weighty messages. Leaflets dropped by balloons and military aircraft in conflict zones as a form of psychological warfare or humanitarian broadcast. Such practices persist today. Lightweight messengers whose material properties facilitate wide, visceral dissemination and whose slightness belies their capacity to portend grave destruction. As we see here too, the light is not slight, not in the least. The weight of such light structures lies in their overt provisionality and intentional defiance of entrenched systems. From cardboard to chipsets, nanocapacitors to nylon, lightweight media are ideologically buoyant, pushed, pitched, toted, or airdropped to serve a range of aesthetic, ethical, and ideological functions. Thank you.
It was wonderful, thank you. And now 2 videos by Sabrina Strings and Pamela Ayo Yetunde.
By the mid-18th century, many Western nations had grown rich on profits from the slave trading enterprise. But of course, profiting from the dehumanization of others might carry the uneasy connotation for Christians, which most of the colonists and race scientists were, of it being obviously immoral. The way they dealt with this was to extend the reach of race science, which had kicked off in the late 17th century. Suddenly, dark skin became evidence of an ancestral curse, the curse of Ham. Now enslaving Black people, that lucrative endeavor, was sanctioned by God and could be reasonably furthered by the God-fearing. In another contortion of Christian ideas, fleshiness, once considered a hallmark of beauty for women across race, became associated by English Puritans and later American Protestants with an animalistic lack of self-control. It was labeled Black and therefore low and heathenistic. Once again, a race-based and Christian colonial solution appeared to address the question of how to continue to make money off the degradation of others and still feel holy. Generalized anti-Blackness and what we might consider its sub-oppressor fat phobia are 2 incredibly important and still lucrative, hello, the price of Ozempic, paradigms. They structure our society today.
In Pure Land Buddhism, the Buddha is understood as infinite light, which is an inspiration for the aspiration for enlightenment. What is enlightenment? It is to be free of delusion. What delusion? For Black liberation, it would be the delusion that our geno and phenotypes make us somehow less human and therefore deserving of oppression, which is not true. Enlightenment awakens us to our true nature, which is basic goodness. Basic goodness is an enlightened understanding of human nature and unending, enlightening potential. Lastly, Black liberation depends on collaboration. Collaboration is supported by the Buddhist view that we are interconnected in a web of life we call Indra's net. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who studied Buddhism, said that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. That is a Buddhist understanding of what it means to be human. We can be clear and reflecting jewels to each other and enlightening gems for each other within Indra's net. So Buddhism is already embedded in Black liberatory thought. May you continue your quest for enlightenment and offer your basic goodness for the liberation of us all. Thank you.
So, and now I would like to call to the podium Sonam Kachru.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Christina. After this, you may think I know not a lot about lightness, but I tell you what, my feet are not touching the ground. It's a wonderful feeling. I want to begin by telling you about a place you may not have heard of. It's called Siddhashila. In the cosmology of the Jain religious tradition, it is the apex of the world, a pure region, and it is to which liberated souls ascend. Liberated souls like this gorgeous being to your left, graceful, a dream of light and motion and marble, and who lives in New York City at the Met. I used to imagine the condition the way Pharrell Williams sings it in Happy, something like a hot air balloon that could go to space. Can nothing bring them down? If we are to be creatures of such ascent, we must be light, you might say. But technically, the philosophers of this tradition say that the properties of heaviness and lightness do not apply. For in this condition, we are no longer creatures of stuff, not individuated the way things are. Heaviness and lightness, always paired properties, explain why things hold the shapes they do, why stuff does not flow into each other. Actions are stuff for these philosophers, and they stick to the soul, obscuring it, weighing it down. Liberated beings in this tradition, when liberated, have no history of actions, no physical or social rank, no class. They are, as Pharrell Williams would have put it, a room without a roof. Imagine it, no roof, no walls, souls as liberated as the beings they were in life, living outside of domestic domiciles. But you've heard Paula quote Kundera, is heaviness truly deplorable? Is lightness splendid? Unbearable likeness. Imagine the unbearable likeness of having to answer, should we be light or heavy? The Buddha would have agreed with Mr. Kundera before disagreeing. A person, the Buddha of this world, I should say, and not of the Pure Land that Pamela was just speaking about, this world being a much heavier world. The Buddha of this world taught a heavier truth. A person, he said, should be thought of as a bearer of a burden. A person with a name, a family, being such and so, for being someone is to carry a burden. So far, so similar to Kundera. But the Buddha wanted us to put this burden down. Taking up a name, as the Buddha would say, is pain. Laying down the burden is peace, and an acquired lightness of being of which we should not be afraid. Now, that's heavy stuff. Honestly, when I was first asked to come and talk to you all and to think with you all about this, I wish I had the foresight to think about these heavy questions. I first thought I'd have no idea what the word lightness means in Sanskrit or where it shows up in my day-to-day work. It's a term in pre-modern Indian natural physics. That's usually where I see it. It's the opposite of gravity when used literally. As a physical property, it can also be used qualitatively, not metaphorically, to explain why certain sensory complexes, like smells, are lighter or distinct in kind from certain other sort of things, haptic qualities, for example. Most often in my work, I find it in the context of not found objects, but made objects, the things philosophers do, explanations or definitions. Explanations are said to be lighter, not, as we would say, simpler. Now, a state of affairs is ontologically lighter if it has fewer elements. I'm about to tell you about a little puzzle I had that talked me into these issues today. A model of states of affairs in language or in thought can be said to be better if lighter or simpler, and I've never really understood why. Necessary when making things or explaining things, sure, but it's not always that helpful to say so. Because sometimes having fewer things means not being as accurate. The world can be terribly messy. And sometimes having fewer things in your explanation is not a sign, is not intended as a sign that you understand something. On the contrary, some of the philosophers I work with insist on not adding elements to show that we do not always possess the conceptual tools to understand the world. The world is more complex, more wondrous than we can imagine. Now, I was looking around for things to say about this. I was trying to be smart, weighty, and sort of earn my keep, when I chanced across a word in Japanese, a language I do not, alas, speak, and which I must now discuss very lightly, in a sense you will see in a moment. Haruo Shirane, in a discussion on karumi, likeness, I think I turned everything off. I unplugged us. I didn't mean that. I meant to just go to the next slide. Philosophers, yeah? There's no taking us anywhere, certainly nowhere where tech is involved. There is a norm in Japanese poetry, particularly in the Japanese poet Basho's haiku, a norm that he developed over time and came to adhere to increasingly. One should avoid heaviness and choose lightness. But what does that mean? Avoid allegory, avoid symbols, return to everyday subject matter, avoid abstraction, avoid posturing, avoid relaxed, rhythmical, seemingly artless expressions. Okay, I thought that I can understand that, but it didn't get me to the pith of it. I wanted more, and there was more to be had. The real lesson of lightness is relationality. Is that really only 1 minute left? What a terrible burden to bear. The real lesson, as the aesthetician Toso Mitsuoki would put it, the painter who's painting chrysanthemums and quailers right here, is that the essence of painting, he said, can be summarized in one word: lightness. The idea is the overall design should be left incomplete. We can not just find lightness in the world, we can make it, we can change ourselves. I'm going to tell you about a little exercise in a yoga tradition to change our bodies. And that's where I'll end. There is a demanding attentional exercise in which regimenting your focus on the relationship of your body to space, and over time beginning to imagine new sorts of objects like cotton or atoms picked up from theory, and thinking about the way atoms and cotton move through space, you can acquire lightness, a freedom from the ways in which you find your body to be tied to space. A commentator, Vachaspati Mishra, writing in the 14th century, says, and sounds like Immanuel Kant, that you can never quite imagine a body without space. But, and here's where he says something Kant does not, we don't know what the body can be like in its relationship with space. This is where the imagination comes in. Now, one paragraph more. The true nature of lightness and weightiness, though, is almost always acquired too late. By the time we think of ourselves in terms of lightness and heaviness, one theologian, Nilakanta, says, it's usually after a crisis has intervened, and we realize we don't know how we have been in the world, and we don't know how to think about the ways in which we were, say, when we were healthy, and now we're not. And we don't even know how to treat the apparent lightness, whether it is truly light or immensely burdensome, but just that the burden is carried by others. The true lesson of the longest, surely the weightiest, the most burdensome poem in the world, the Mahabharata, is almost hidden from view. It is when the earth speaks and says of an entirely too technologically successful generation of humans that she has grown weary. She can't bear the weight of humans who never die and who propagate without end. And she prays and prays until God says, I will make you light. I will answer your prayer and give you relief. The problem is that we who hear the earth's burden are survivors of the Holocaust of the humans that had to happen for the earth's burden to be lifted. And then our question is, how do we carry forward such a history? Lightly, or with the weight of the knowledge that this is to happen again? Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. And now we have a video by calligrapher Nuria Garcia Masip.
As a calligrapher, we immediately associate lightness to our instrument, which is the kalam, a hollow reed pen which will eventually become an extension of our fingers and of our hand. My master used to always say, hold the kalam as if you were holding a little bird. with control, but essentially with a lot of lightness. And it is this lightness of touch that we learn as calligraphers through our training, through endless repetition and practice, trying to always keep a small gap of space between the column and the page to allow the ink to flow freely and to achieve this breath-like stroke of the line. As calligraphers, our practice is based on balance, and this means embodying a certain lightness of mind, of spirit, of body, holding our breath and being able to control and keeping our fingers, our hand, and our arms nimble and light. But we cannot have lightness, we cannot convey lightness without also having the presence of heaviness. And so it is the presence and the balance of these two elements, the heavy stroke and the light stroke, which will eventually convey the dynamic movement of the line and the visual harmony and rhythm.
In Susa.
Thank you. What an honor it is to be here with you today. There are so many ways in which I think we can marry the themes of surgery and lightness, but I'll just pick two. The first lens is more of a technical one. We're speaking about lightness, but in some sense, the idea of surgery is, I think, fairly weighty in the popular imagination. It's no wonder why. Surgery is among the most serious, intimate, personal, traumatic, and invasive methods of healthcare that we as humans have invented. Surgery is often the most immediate way of addressing a particular illness when it's come to a head. An appendix is infected and needs to be removed before it ruptures inside the abdomen. A heart valve has reached its last legs and needs repair or replacement as the heart starts to fail, and other endless examples. These are real life-altering diseases with real weighty burdens associated with them, and surgeons are often called to relieve patients of these problems. Sometimes the weight to be lifted is literal. My specific field of clinical practice is endocrine surgery, as mentioned, which usually involves the removal of certain glands that produce hormones, such as the adrenal, thyroid, and parathyroid, when they develop conditions such as cancers. But the concept of surgery, and until recently its historical and practical reality, has involved a certain level of ironic acceptance in that the patient would transfer all of the pains and burdens of the disease over to another unique set of pains and horrors associated with the actual surgical treatment. And oh, horrible it was. Over the expanse of human history, surgery was for the most part, and until very recently, a medieval, horrible, brutal sport that from a technical perspective may have had more in common with torture than as a therapeutic discipline. Crude, heavy, large, often metal tools were used to grasp, pull, retract, clamp, cut, pry open, and seal shut the huge wounds through which surgery was attempted. The advancements in antisepsis and anesthesia over time made surgery far less warlike, but the inherent brutality and the postoperative suffering that occurred remained for a very long time. And so to the opposite concept, lightness. Surgery as a field has made astounding advancements, admittedly, in the past half century, mostly in order to minimize our footprint on our patients using an ever lighter and lighter touch. In many cases, gone are the days in which medieval tools that make gigantic and painful incisions are needed in order to access a deeper part of the body. Now, more refined techniques using smaller incisions, advanced cameras, and lighter and thinner tools are feasible now, and in many cases the standard of care. In my field, a very common operation is the thyroidectomy, or the removal of the thyroid gland, which is a butterfly-shaped organ near the bottom of the neck. This operation's history is amazing. From a 50% mortality rate in the 1850s, enough for a prominent American surgeon named Samuel Gross to famously proclaim at the time that no sensible surgeon should ever do this, since, quote, every step will be envisioned with difficulty, every stroke of the knife will be followed by a torrent of blood, and lucky will it be if the victim lives long enough to enable the surgeon to finish this horrid butchery. And now this operation has been transformed into an hour-long procedure with a much smaller incision and the expectation that the patient can safely go home the same day. In fact, now that safety, pain, and recovery have largely been addressed, surgeons like myself and my colleagues at Johns Hopkins who created this video are now able to go even further with technologies and techniques that enable scarless surgery to enable and lift the burden of an incision in the neck that leaves a visible scar, which patients often describe as a daily weighty reminder of the disease that they had once had or still have when they look in the mirror. I also happen to run a program in surgical innovation, and in which role I bear witness to, in one sense, an amazing future of surgery, one that invents and employs robots out of sci-fi movies, augmented reality vision, and artificial intelligence to push the envelope in what's possible to achieve ever better outcomes for patients, but at what cost? What price point? What ecological footprint? To switch gears now, the second lens through which I'd like to examine lightness in surgery is from a more personal one as a surgeon. Within the healthcare sector, surgeons are more likely than other physicians to see themselves as performers. After all, we're trained to do just that in the operating room. Performance is at the core of what we do and the primary metric by which we are judged by our patients, peers, online, and society at large. And yes, in our own hubris, we do sometimes compare ourselves to other types of elite performers, athletes, performance artists, etc. As performers always seeking perfection, I think we all do subscribe to the concept often summarized by the Yerkes-Dodson theory and its curve shown here, which states that there is an optimal level of arousal that results in optimal performance. In fact, I think we all subscribe to this to some extent. In whatever we do, we are at our best when we are in that optimal state of flow at the top of this curve. That is when we are lightest on our feet, or with our hands, as the case may be. In this state, we can move mountains, and when we look up, we are surprised that hours had passed. In my version of the flow state in the operating room, I am relaxed. The staff in the room is prepared and aligned. There's a feel-good, vibey music in the background. And even when we run into a little bleeding or a hiccup, we know what we do, and we got this. But we are human and, of course, are imperfect. Our operations can have complications, less and less commonly to be sure, but they still do. Our patients can suffer directly because of us. And over time, this takes a toll, as my own wife, Vero, has witnessed many a time. I love this old quote from René Lariche, a French vascular surgeon and physiologist, which captures the sentiment perfectly. Of course, please excuse the gendered language, it's a product of its time. Every surgeon carries within himself a small cemetery where from time to time he goes to pray, a place of bitterness and regret where he must look for an explanation for his failures. Surgery is a heavy load, and the people who go into this field understand this only partially when they first start out. Every complication and bad outcome leads to moments of grief and self-doubt often suffered alone. This is described in the literature in different ways with terms like moral injury and second victim syndrome. And if the surgeon has not developed the personal and spiritual toolkit and social support, can lead to a spiraling of despair and a paralyzing fear of the next operation. Not to mention career burnout, which is a major problem with modern surgeons today. We always need to find ways to dig out from this weight and get back to being lighter on our feet again. Without, of course, the drawbacks, being too flippant and careless, too emotionally shut off from the moment and perhaps not empathetic enough to reflect on its weight. And so in closing, I, as a surgeon, would want to embody the mixture of focus, seriousness, and joy of the basketball star Steph Curry. I've taken the liberty of mixing and matching a few of his quotes. I always have confidence, whether I miss 4 in a row or make 4 in a row, that the next one's going in. I'll live with the results, whether I miss and coach shakes his head, or I make it and everybody claps for me. It's a confidence that's built on the foundation of work and reps I put in. I can get better. I haven't reached my ceiling yet. You've got to be free on the court. I think that's a good balance of light and weight. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have a video from Brandon Linton, who is a race sailboat designer.
We use newer versions of the same materials we've been building these boats out of for the past 30 years. We use carbon fibre impregnated cloth, we use aluminium honeycombs, we use Kevlar honeycombs, and we'll also occasionally use foam sheet. The knowledge of how these materials perform under loads has increased in the last 30 years though. And engineers will also use software to understand better to where to place more material and where to take more material away to save some weight. I'm constantly refining my own construction methods by introducing new technologies. Recently, we've had a lot of success using 3D scanning hardware and software, where we can take 3D scans of our hulls, decks and structures, and that combined with a 5-axis CNC machine, we can cut perfectly shaped parts to fit inside our yachts. That takes the dirty work away from boat builders, but it also means more accurately fitting parts, which means less adhesive, which means less weight. We'll always try to make our yachts as light as possible. However, the forces applied to the sails of a yacht needs to be counteracted to prevent capsize. This is normally in the form of ballast. This is most noticeable as a torpedo-shaped lead bulb at the bottom of a fixed or canting keel of a yacht. The term canting keel refers to a hydraulically operating swing keel, which is most noticeable on the 100-foot yacht Comanche. These are particularly effective as they create greater leverage to counter the forces applied to the sails, and so less weight is required to counteract the forces and therefore less wetted surface of the boat. A more radical example of this is the new AC-75 class yacht, where there's 2 canting foil arms and the amount of boat that's left in the water is absolutely minimal. Another limitation to lightness is that the boat can withstand all the loads, necessary loads applied to it. One obvious one is keeping the ocean on the outside of the vessel and adhering to any governing body's requirements for the particular yacht and the regattas that it will be entered into.
So selfish. I mean, I'm the daughter of a surgeon and I'm a sailor, so everything is about my fashions tonight. I would like to call to the podium Glaucio Paulino, please.
Thank you. And I am going to talk to you about origami across scales, STEAM approach to lightness, and the previous talk was very good to introduce my talk because I saw that the yacht is called American Magic. And I would like to ask, do you like magic? Yes. Excellent. The reason for that is because one of the most striking results in the field of origami started as magic. And I would like to demonstrate that for you. And Christina, can you help me? And let me just tell you what this is. Just a piece of paper. And I will ask her to give a straight cut. And let's see what is going to happen. And while she does that, and let's forget a little bit about her, let's let her concentrate. We can go to the next slide, and then you can see, can you show the next? Oh, thank you.
It's the big one, yeah.
Thank you. As I said, this started, this field started as magic, and it started with Houdini. Oh, you already did it. Excellent. All right. And, but then, at that time, he was only able to do, for example, with the fold and one cut, what Christina just demonstrated, simple figures like the star or a simple animal and so on. And today, well, I'm spoiling the surprise. What you will see that Christina has done, we wanted to do MoMA, and then there are some steps in the math that I am showing here, the shrink and the expansion of the polygon, and creating some of the lines and doing some of the math that we need, the skeleton lines, the crease pattern. And at the end, if everything works well, then we are going to have a mountain valley assignment. And the helpers, can you come? She need your help here too. Let's see what we get with this. Here are the letters you can help, and this is for me. Is there an M in there? I think.
Yay.
This was just a All right. So this is what we just did. And origami is fascinating. It's a pervasive field. It connects with every talk here. For example, in the surgical field, a lot of the surgical instruments, they are based on origami mechanism, especially in the Da Vinci system that you showed. And here is a special issue of National Geographic. It says the future is folded, how origami is reshaping our world, and this is the star shade. And this was done at JPL. In general, origami, when you go to space, things have to be very light and compact for the ride, and very big at the destination. This is the star shade. The things that you see here this was done in JPL. This was to simulate an anti-gravity environment. Essentially, the star shade is like when you take a photograph. For them to photograph the star, then they have to have a star shade so that the light will not disturb your photography, right? And here you can see the beauty and the complexity of origami. This is the Dragon by Satoshi Kamiya. See the richness of the details, the head, the level of details, the horn, the scales, the foot. How many pieces of paper to do this? One, folding only. I will briefly show to you, for example, some work that we did using Lego metamaterials to build modular, reconfigurable, and multi-stable origami assemblies. Here is a Kreslin unit. This is named after Miss Kreslin, a wonderful artist and person. And over there we have opposite chiralities. And when we have opposite chiralities, we get this effect. You see? And we can use this to do materials with very interesting properties. And in the interest of time, I may not show this slide, or what I am showing. That's okay. What happened is we assemble all this here, and the colors represent different types of materials. You can see that the blue will be always actuated first, and then it will be the white, and then the yellow. And these offer us a lot of opportunities to create new material systems. For example, we do some outreach activities in our lab, and we invite children, for example, and give them these Legos, for example, and they can just place the Legos here the way they want. And the way they do the placement will give us different materials with different material properties, and they love it. And for example, this one creates, I will not explain, but you can see that this load here represents the behavior of the material. This is one kind of behavior that was created. Here is another kind, another, and you have many ways to do this. And recently, we generalized this, and this made the cover of PNAS. This doing a modular, multi-degree of freedom, soft origami robots with reprogrammable electrothermal actuation. And essentially, what this here is a biomimetic mirror. You can see here the caterpillar, and here is our robot. Essentially, the electrothermal actuators are these orange things here, and these are the Kreslin units. When we break the rotational symmetries, then it can bend. If we don't break the rotational symmetries, then the robot can move. And in the future, for example, this kind of robots could be used, for example, for drug delivery, because these units, they don't need to be empty. And then if we can miniaturize this can go inside the body, they could deliver drug where you need, when you need. And we done 10 seconds. Now talking about the scales, right? Then we now can do materials that are pretty big or pretty small. And this is very beautiful. It is. Is about more than a meter. And this is 30 microns. Then this entire material is the size of your hair that you see over there. And now you can see here, this material has many interesting properties. In the interest of time, I can just give you the reference, and I'll show you how to deploy this. And this is what was done there in the microscale.
Definitely tonight will leave you wanting for more. You can all study their work online. And next is a video by Daniel Barber, who's an architectural theorist.
I want to talk about lightness in relationship to air, and through that in relationship to comfort, which is to say, the ways in which the air that you're breathing, but also the kind of air that surrounds you, the thermal conditions that you are currently occupying, that tend to condition our built environment, are in fact manufactured, are processed, right, are conditioned while they are conditioning us to expect a certain thermal consistency. And it seems to be light, right? That appears to be a sort of experience of that air, of that conditioned air, experience of lightness. The production of comfort is reliant upon fossil fuels, to put it simply. The power plants that feed into the air conditioning systems, burning coal or burning oil or burning natural gas. Of course, the conditions of extraction, the conditions of the distribution of those fuels around the world are all ripe for labor exploitation and quite often harrowing conditions. So, many people are suffering, right, so that we can breathe freely and sort of walk lightly. As Richard Neutra put it in 1947, there has always been comfort in the world, reckless comfort, we could say, comfort based on someone else's continuous labors, that quote. So to propose a sort of lightening of comfort might be to encourage those of us around the world who have benefited from the pleasures of carbon-based mechanical systems for the past century or so to kind of sink into that privilege, right? To bring into our awareness the heaviness of comfort and conditioning. If we want to then tread lightly, right, to allow for future life scenarios, we, those of us in MoMA salons and acclimatized institutions around the world, might consider allowing ourselves to be more uncomfortable, right? Could be a moment to call the facility staff and ask them to turn down the air conditioning in the lecture hall to lighten things up.
And now I would like to call to the podium Ariel Ekblau.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here tonight. Paola and Christina, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I am a space architect, and so what it means is I work on space stations and the design of a life in space worth living while floating. So in particular, we're trying to design the spaces that are in microgravity, in free fall around the Earth. Of course, there's never anything truly called zero gravity. There's always gravity between two objects, as any physicist will tell you. But there are really magical, special situations where you are in free fall, and so your body experiences it like weightlessness, like floating. Now, one of the ways in which we test our work before we actually get a chance to take it to space is on something called a zero-gravity flight. Now, a zero-gravity flight is a plane, just like what you take, on a flight across the Atlantic, but it does what you'd want a plane never to do, pitches really steeply upwards at 45 degrees, noses over, pitches really steeply towards the ground at 45 degrees, and then flies that parabolic arc 30 or 40 times in a row in the sky. So it's essentially a bit of laughter and levity is worth it. It's basically a roller coaster in the sky, affectionately known by NASA as the Vomit Comet. No longer much more comfortable for astronauts, but it's how we at MIT and at my new design firm, Aurelia Institute, it's how we test our work before we take it to space, and it's how NASA astronauts have always traditionally experienced this sublime sense of weightlessness. Imagine that you're in a pool, but there's no water. You're swimming, but there's no drag. There's nothing to push back against you. It is an incredibly moving experience. And one of the best pieces of advice I was ever given before my 10 flights that I have now done is to make a memory, a physical memory while on that flight, because the experience of weightlessness is so fleeting, and it's such a different body feel than anything else that we experience on Earth that in 6 months you'll forget what it's really like. It takes that much concentration in a moment like this to crystallize for your body what weightlessness really feels like. Now, these photos you're going to see are an arc of my body changing as we go through this floating. And what I'm testing here is my own PhD research. It's robotic self-assembly. So I did my work at MIT thinking about how do we build architecture in orbit that's bigger than our biggest rocket payload fairings. How do you build really grand scale architecture worthy of science fiction? Well, it probably needs to be modular and self-assembling, like Legos or very lightweight structures that build themselves. And so these are small examples of these tiles that I have been working on. And you see me continue to float up and up and up and away. I'm going to show you a few other examples of wonderful disciplines that we bring into this lightness. So this is Annie Liu, an artist who was just recently on the stage at a salon. So perhaps a few of you for the MoMA Salon had a chance to meet Annie. This is Nicole Louillier, an artist who specializes in music. This is a musical instrument that she designed to be able to be only played in microgravity. So it doesn't make music, it doesn't produce sound on the Earth. A really beautiful example of using the new affordances, the design affordances of zero gravity to create new cultural artifacts instead of just recycling or bringing the things that we've already developed on Earth into our life in space. And then finally, one of my dear friends, Xing Liu, who is an internationally renowned artist now and also has explored many different aspects of materiality in space. In this case, material that was created from reused plastic, recovered from the ocean, trying to clean up our oceans, and trying to do a dialogue here about sea creatures, designing with this idea of communing between the deep sea and deep space. We also fly with astronauts, and the reason I show you Katie Coleman here on the left is she is a pro at moving in lightness, moving in microgravity. And what she would tell you if she was here is that all it takes to move along the entire linear space of that fuselage inside the plane is a single touch of your finger on a wall, and you'll zoom across the entire plane. Another interesting fact from their lives in space is that instead of gravity bearing us down and walking on the bottoms of our feet and needing soles for our shoes, the astronauts ask for soles on the tops of their feet. They're constantly slipping their feet under straps to stay in place, or else you'll float away. And so just another interesting design tweak to how we're thinking about the affordances of this environment. I believe Seiwei is here in the audience, a fellow member of my lab who's worked with me for many years, an amazing co-partner of CW&T Studio here in Brooklyn, designing a compass for space, partly for orientation. When we think about space habitats and space architecture, the idea of a ceiling, walls, and a floor really makes no sense. We no longer need to think within those constraints of architecture. We can completely reorient. There's also just a sense of delight and levity in a zero-gravity environment. And I think it's worth calling out here that even the most seasoned MIT professors cannot help but giggle when they are brought on a flight. Now, what's the good of all this practice in zero-G? Well, it's to build a life in space worth living. We're trying to build space habitats where you can grow, cook, eat, break bread together in space, Design algae stained glass windows where the sunlight comes through the algae, produces oxygen for the habitat, and also allows a little bit of beauty and aesthetics back into the design of life in space? Can we use space to create biotechnology products that would change our lives here on Earth? Do space with a purpose, balance the lightness with purpose so it's not a frivolous pursuit for space exploration. There are so many proteins that we know fold differently in the microgravity environment than they do on Earth. Huge potential for growing organoids, for cancer treatment. I see Chris Mason in the back. Hey, Chris, maybe you can tell a little bit about the audience later about this amazing potential for using space and the microgravity environment in particular to create new and novel products for health outcomes here on Earth. And of course, the great irony of it all is that after we go to all these links to get zero gravity in space, to do these space stations, it turns out we actually want to bring a little bit of gravity back. This is an idea from my space architecture studio where we would spin each ring at a different rate to get a bit of artificial gravity. Turns out, despite how fun zero gravity is, we desperately need gravity for the health of our bones, our heart, a lot of our physiological systems. And so actually being able to envision life in space for long duration missions, we need to bring the gravity back. And so you need to be able to have some part of your space station spin to keep your astronauts and your crew healthy. And with that, I'll pause there. I hope I'm on time, and thank you so much. We are based out of the MIT Space Initiative, and I just wanted to say this is very credible in your lifetimes. Certainly in your children's lifetimes, there will be opportunities to go and experience life in space, and we're working to democratize access to it. Thank you so much.
And now we have a video by Jonathan Stern.
Hello, MoMA R&D Salon. I'm Jonathan Stern, coming to you from Jojage, also known as Montreal. What if we lived in a world where no piece of music was longer than 10 seconds? I want to talk to you today about heaviness masquerading as lightness. And I'm specifically talking about the fantasies of light, friction-free, labor-free culture that are promised by corporate generative artificial intelligence, acknowledging that our AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. When we look at the emerging generative music applications, the most things like Stable Audio, Suno.ai, most of these applications were built up on very small snippets of sound recordings, so very short pieces of tracks. And that produces a kind of skewed worldview of music. But they had to do that because of the computational weight and expense of actually taking the full length of sound recordings. So even if we're thinking about a company as big as Google and a platform as full of sound recordings as something like YouTube, even with all their servers and data farms and everything else, they had to compress, they had to sample in order to be able to produce a tool. So that tool provides a rather distorted view and a rather distorted experience of the musical world. I have much more to say, but I'm out of time. So, best wishes to all of you.
Yeah, we always everybody always runs out of time. But well, I would like to call to the podium now Sarah Oppenheimer.
Thank you, Christina and Paola. Our environment contains us, and its machines maintain us, creating an entwined ecosystem of context and habitation. How might our presence within these systems remake their hierarchies and interdependencies? What must be emphasized or obscured, pronounced or concealed to amplify our sense of interconnection? We imagine the floor beneath our feet will support our weight. We assume that turning a handle will open a door. The pattern behavior of the environment directs our understanding of its affordances and shapes our sense of possibility. I manipulate mass within these patterned environmental frequencies. This work creates a heightened awareness of surrounding material conditions. In The Perception of Causality, published in 1963, Albert Michaud describes his use of visual models in cognitive studies. Subjects are presented with a red and blue dot traveling along a white line. As the colored pair interacts, subjects associate physical properties with the dot's behaviors. Their movement creates a perception of momentum, inertia, entrainment. In this visual model, volume is weightless, motion is seamless. In physical prototypes, material properties shape dynamic behavior. When translating a model to the material world, we encounter physical feedback. My prototypes begin on a small scale, exploring how touch shapes the position of a handheld interface. Activators learn the feel of a surface, its momentum, its reflected inertia. Each iteration tunes the temporal phasing between gesture and instrument. Mass is distributed between weight and counterweight. Placing weight here, removing weight there, shifts the center of gravity. Lightness is achieved through a calibrated material relay. To return to Michaud's experiment, as the camera zooms out, each dot is revealed to be a curved line. The geometry of each line alters the apparent influence of one dot upon another. The mechanism used to simulate these behaviors is buried, quite literally, behind a black box. Michaud's experiments create the sensation of mass in visual artifacts. I induce a sensation of lightness in heavy volumes. Sensitive Machine, exhibited at the Welland Museum of Art in 2021, is a hybrid, part human, part digital, part analog. Touch sets in motion a dynamic exhibition system. As visitors manually turn a black beam, lighting tracks slip between the vertical surfaces of sliding walls. A choreography is set in motion by human hand. Orientation, scale, and affordance shape the gestural action of the human operator. Positional change is perceived through tactile sensation and proprioceptive feedback. Lifting a distal, massive volume requires the lightest touch. Here, too, technical ensembles are camouflaged within the body of the building. Cams and cables travel through partition walls only to reappear overhead as a crisscrossing array. Network linkages are partially obscured. The opacity of the white wall operates as a technical black box, encouraging a process of testing and probing. We may notice an adjacent wall is moving because it alters our immediate surroundings, blocking or clearing our path. but we may be unaware of a lighting track descending overhead. How do we identify the form of this networked relay when we are participants in the system? Learning the entwined energetic pathway is part of the viewer's work. Now, more than ever, we must consider how spatial proximity and spatial agency are defined. What are the implications of extending sensory pathways across non-contiguous spaces? What are the consequences of engineering awareness with new tools and technologies? My work explores these periodic and collaborative dynamics. This cannot be completed alone. A touch modulates the space in between.
Could you please come and say thank you? Very beautiful. So I'm going to take the last, but we all sit here. A lot of magic tonight, you know. So in all of your work, there's magic because everything transcends the limits of what we feel is our heaviness and gravity. So thank you for these beautiful presentations. Talking about, you know, we have so many great questions for you all, but I'm going to start with Shannon. So Shannon, you spoke about leaflets, you spoke about all of these like the cardboard box, all of these like very light objects that carry such heavy weight. And you know, you also wrote a wonderful piece where you talked about the dust and the paper that blanketed New York after the 9/11 attacks. And you spoke about the importance of lightness in that it allowed these materials to travel far and wide. So that's the epitome of like heaviness in lightness. Can you talk a little bit about that? Can you about that essay and your concept?
You mean specifically about the...
Yeah, you can start talking and then it'll turn on.
Okay,
magic.
specifically about the September 11th piece?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was at the New School. I taught at the New School for about 20 years before moving to the University of Pennsylvania, and we had an event there about materiality and memory, specifically focused on documentary film, but I do pretty much everything but film. So I talked about other media formats and how they capture memory in different ways. And I happened to be here in grad school on September 11th, living on the West Side, sat in a playground, watched all these dust-covered people walk up the street on their way home, and just thought about not only the fluttering paper, but also how the paper, the material objects of everyday bureaucracy, the quotidian reality was upended, was turned into something aerosol, papers fluttering over to Brooklyn. So just all these different media formats and how in their transformation they captured the memory, the trauma of that day. So yeah, the things of papers floating on air, material things, bodies in many cases, huge architectures, to go to Sarah's comments about like in engineering, turned into dust, turned into aerosol, solids turned into air. Made very light, but embodying through their lightness kind of the really complicated materialities and the heaviness of everything that happened that day.
Yeah, we wanted to bring it to everybody's attention because it was another really symbolic coming together of heaviness and lightness. Christina, on to you.
Yeah, I wanted to pose a question to Sonam, and in thinking about also the work you didn't touch on tonight, but other lives, and the way you talk about sort of like mindedness or getting into the mind of kind of another being as a way to sort of, like approach how we perceive the world. And it also, I thought it was interesting because it plays with this kind of nature of object and subject, which I thought Sarah's work, and we just heard it, that kind of touches on that. But I was wondering how you might talk about those ideas in relationship to kind of producing a certain kind of lightness of being.
Well, first, let me say thank you for reading any of my work. It's an incredible sensation. Not very frequently enjoyed. But I think I can best connect to the idea. So this Other Lives is a book exploring why Buddhist philosophers of a certain generation began thinking with stories or ideas of life forms very different from our own. And the idea is that they generated thought experiments and imaginative possibilities for coming up with redescriptions of our own lives. Now, these are ideas we could take seriously in our own practice. To connect it with lightness, I think the Japanese aesthetics of lightness gives us a clue. This idea that no work of art or no object is successful if self-contained. That there is something about inviting in the audience or the spectators, which is a kind of a passive idea. I'm speaking here, but there's so many practitioners of these arts with us today in the audience and among us who can say so much more. This idea that witnessing or experiencing a work of art can't be passive. It is entering into the work of art to produce these sorts of transformative experiences. I think connecting that with what we do through the technologies that we take for granted, like conversation, argument, listening, as parts of, as continuous with transformative practices that can be light or heavy, more or less closed off, more or less completed, or their success criteria determined in advance before the event of them, let's say. I think that's where I would take it, and I think it extends to every technology we have, the novel, the paragraph, like I was saying, the argument, this idea that we don't really know what they will do or what they are capable of before they're allowed to live, not just in our own minds, but in the spaces of other beings, other times, other cultures. Yeah.
Thank you. So a question for Insoo. So if we still are human beings with our body and with our gravity, it must be hard to translate ourselves into the lightness of touch of a robot that's doing a Da Vinci surgery. So I'm wondering, pretty much like astronauts in space, you must train yourself to have a different kind of body when you use a lightness of touch that is mediated by a machine. How does it feel, and how did you train yourself to be lighter?
Oh boy. So I can answer that in a very technical way first, and then maybe in a little bit more of a maybe a humanistic, existential way. So technically, the Da Vinci robot has limitations in that it doesn't have any haptic feedback. So you have to rely on other senses in order to now reapproximate. It's almost like losing a sight or something, so all the other senses get heightened. In this case, the sight, their main selling point, if you will, is that they have a telescopic three-dimensional view that they offer through a specialized camera. So any movement that's caught as an errant move, you could catch with your very acute eyes as opposed to feeling it. They are trying to build a haptic capability, and many other robots are trying to do that as well. But I think that's a story for another day. I don't think that there is, for any surgeon, a substitute for having, not to get too gruesome here, hands inside the mode of operation in the area that we're trying to heal in, because there's no substitute for that. I don't know if I can describe it any other way. You truly have an intimate relationship with the patient and their disease in a manner that you will never have with all these technologies.
We're a robot. Yeah, thank you. And I am going to similarly speak with Glausio about something like that, the change in scale. Origami, and also the demo that you just showed us, allows you to change scale, and to build at different scales, but also to have one object change in scale. I remember once seeing a great lecture by Issei Miyake that was showing the pleats please process, and basically a t-shirt before being pleated goes from here to there, right? So do you only count on math to establish the object, or do you also try to have a feedback that is physical? Do you imagine it as a human being imagining an object?
Yeah, I would say both. To start with, the math is very important because origami is wonderful, can give us amazing results, but is very unforgiving. You need to be very precise, very accurate. Otherwise, you don't get the results that you are looking for. And the mathematics is extremely important because from there We can go to engineering, to physics, medicine, other fields. Unfortunately, most of the mathematical theorems, they have been done considering that the thickness is 0. But in reality, this doesn't exist. And the real things, they have different thickness, different materials, different properties. And then that addresses the second part of your question. And that's when we need to think in the scale that we are. For example, if we start to do a tube of the scale that I showed, gravity plays a big role. But when I did it the size of your hair, 100 microns, gravity is irrelevant to other.
Thank you.
Christina. Excuse me, I wanted to ask a question to Sarah. So, I mean, the way we began this conversation, Paula had talked about kind of the realm of the domestic and also speaking to the ways in which our built environment not only shapes space, but also codifies the way certain roles or our behaviors within it. And I think what's beautiful about your work is it allows the participant a sense of agency in shaping space around them and therefore affecting change that they wouldn't really normally otherwise get to kind of experience. So I'd be curious to hear about sort of your thoughts on the relationship sort of between agency or participation and lightness.
I think this is a really relevant to the question that was addressed to you about learning how your agency is transmitted through, let's say, a robotic system. And I think one of the great challenges of inhabiting our environment is that it is in some ways very familiar to us, and then in other ways, as it becomes increasingly mechanized, it becomes alien. And so we're constantly in this balance of trying to find ourselves within this system. And I think to answer your question, Christina, the ability for us to experience agency in some ways has to do with the resistance of the environment to us. And so lightness, whether it is actually weightedness or simply ease of enacting, I think is a sensation that is transmitted back to us through where we are.
Thank you. And now I have a question for Ariel. I've been thinking a lot also because I'm freezing, and we know, talking about comfort and convenience, we know that office buildings are usually the temperature is set for a male 35-year-old, usually, there were all these discussions. I'm freezing. But anyway, I was thinking of what Daniel Barber and Edmund Hinton were talking about, the idea of comfort and convenience, and wondering how can we all change our sense of, or our standards of comfort and convenience. So I wanted to ask you about comfort and convenience in space. How do you, because that could be a good learning process for us, how do you change expectations of convenience and comfort in space?
Thank you for the question. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing in the space industry right now is that people still have this conception of what it means to be an astronaut as an impeccably well-trained, typically ex-military or at least heavily trained by the government, peak human talent expedition, basically, specimen. Right. And how do we make space more comfortable and convenient or even just welcoming for the rest of us? And so what we're doing at Aurelia is trying to democratize access to space, but the first step in democratizing access to space is make it a place that you would all want to go to. And a lot of people look at the International Space Station and say, looks like a science lab. Not everybody wants to live in a science lab that's cold and has a lot of wires and a bunch of other equipment floating around. And so one of the first things that we do is actually we do user research with people who have flown to space and say, what's missing for you within comfort and care? What are the things that you miss? And one of the things that comes up so frequently is a sense of Earth. We really actually want to preserve biophilia, a love of nature. We want to bring some of Earth with us. And I think it's one of the greatest learnings that we've had that maybe the mission of space exploration should not in any way be to abandon Earth and to go live on Mars, but to leverage space stations in orbit to improve life on Earth, or to learn more about climate change, or to be able to create biotech products that improve our day-to-day life. And so to make that a life worth living, to have people be willing to go to space and be part of this new economy or part of this future, we have to make their lives comfortable within that domain. We think about everything from HVAC, like the video that you showed before my talk. How do you do direct air carbon capture? How do you turn CO2 into oxygen? How do you do really energy efficient air conditioning? A lot of these comfort technologies, we're hoping, can come from development for the rigors of life in space, come back down to benefit life on Earth as we innovate in construction markets. So there's all kinds of opportunities, I think, for looking at that comfort and care dimension.
And of course, I'm also thinking, then I would like to open to the audience, but when I think of space, I also think about the heaviness and stomping of colonization versus the lightness of touch of exploration, right? That's also just another food for thought. But let's open it to the audience. And even upstairs, if you want to send questions, it's paola_antonelli@moma.org. We won't have much time, but if you send a really fabulous question, I'm going to give you priority. So let's open to the audience. Do you have any questions for our speakers? Oh, we have many. Oh, there's one here. Oh, wait, hold on. Here it comes. Mm-hmm.
I have a quick question. Is there a recording of that music that is only created for space?
Yes, it's called the Telemetron. If you Google Telemetron plus MIT, you will find it. And I'm also very happy to send it to Paola and the team, and we can maybe email it out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me see if I have any questions. There's one there in the middle. Oops. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. I thought everything was brilliant. I have a question for Inso. Could you speak a little bit about the lightness that you bring to the individual before the surgery and the way that that person feels and how you can bring them to a lighter place?
That's an enormously important question. I benefit on some level in being in a specialty that has a lot of diseases that can be cured and treated on a permanent basis. So I don't necessarily share the same conflicts as some of my colleagues that need to deal with diseases that don't have a cure, maybe long-term diseases, or ultimately are mortal. Because that's a very fine balance of maintaining a lightness and giving people hope, which is, in the Venn diagram, I guess, equated to lightness, and also conveying the seriousness of the moment, and et cetera. So for me, one of the things that I think is in my toolkit, if you will, is the idea that knowledge is power. So most people who come into a physician's office or in a healthcare setting have the terror of the unknown unknowns. And those things, I think, conceptually are more of a kind of chaos as opposed to a weightiness. But I can see how weightiness can also play a role. So by giving them all of the information that is relevant to their disease and what to expect from the treatment, I like to pride myself on being very clear with that messaging. Through that, I think the patients do have an enormous weight that's lifted. That's very often just visible. Other times is feedback to me to let me know that that was appreciated. So I do think that in order for the terror to be mitigated, they need that knowledge. And at the same time, I'll just, on the other side of my mouth, say that too much knowledge winds up being also terror-filled. And we also have a lot of patients who do not benefit from having Google. So we have to balance that too.
And as we know from Sonam, clear and simple means light. So yes. Okay, there are some more questions that are coming.
I wonder how you stay oriented in a weightless world, because the way we're oriented is gravity. We know what's up, we know what's down, and we can communicate that. So how do you deal with this, with disorientation and with talking about place and space?
It's a fantastic question. You're absolutely right. So our vestibular system senses a gravity vector, the fluid and the delicate little hairs in your ears. So when you're floating, even on a zero gravity flight or on a space station, you lose that orientation, and it does affect your proprioception, your knowledge of where your body and your limbs are and how you're interacting with other astronauts or fellow space flyers. One of the ways in which NASA and we are thinking about the ergonomics of space, or the design of markers and navigation in space, is to be able to use lighting to give visual cues for orientation, or to be able to give guardrails, things that you would be able to use to grab and pivot around. If you hold on to something with one hand, you'll, kind of go in any direction. If you hold on with two or with a foot and a hand, you can kind of better stabilize yourself and get oriented. And one of the lovely examples of the design thinking that needs to go into this, NASA had thought that maybe it'd be interesting to have a spherical kitchen table, but it turns out people really don't like to see each other upside down while coming together to break bread. It's so important for human biology that we see a face and we see the nose and the mouth and the eyes in a particular vertical order. And so even in the possibility to do everything in all kinds of different orientations, there's a certain anchoring of our own biology that will keep us with some type of an orientation, even in a spherical coordinate system, even in space.
Hey, there are like hands everywhere. Okay, good. Yes. Thank you. There's one coming.
I'm sure everyone noticed that all the speakers and the people asking the questions as well moved sort of willy-nilly and seamlessly from a metaphoric understanding of weightlessness and heaviness to immaterial, or I'll just say material application. And I wonder how you all thought about that as you were preparing, because it's just notable.
Yeah, we did it on purpose in the sense that we could have done an entirely practical evening on light materials or heavy materials, but we wanted to use that metaphor because we felt, Christina and I felt that in this particular moment, metaphors can help a lot, but metaphors without some reality check can become almost nauseating. It's a little bit like being in space and not being able. So we've done it on purpose, and we hope it's an experiment, and we hope that it works. But I find myself having to think of good metaphors pretty much every day, and we thought that this could help. It's a little bit like how the salons work. And then as you ask the next question, I have a very difficult question that arrived via email, and I'm trying to decipher it. So it's not like I'm not paying attention. I'm just trying to understand. Go ahead. Yeah.
I am amazed by all the speakers that you bring your own world of expertise and also make the information very accessible to us. And my question is that, do you learn anything from other speakers or get inspired that you can, that enable you to imagine your own world slightly differently?
So I'm going to, do you have an answer? Because otherwise I'm going to try to ask this really complicated question. Go ahead.
Follow-up, she wanted to know how.
How?
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I tell you what, I don't have an answer to the how question. I think that's actually a very beautiful and deeply mysterious thing about what collaboration does to thought and why we need to think with others in order even to know what we ourselves think. But I'll say, it's not just listening to these wonderful speakers that has provided insight, inspiration, and allowed me to reformulate what I was thinking. It's preparing to speak with others too, like even the prompts, or like all the work of thinking about where we're going to be speaking and how all of it enters into this strange alchemy that changes even the certainties one thought one knew. So that's not an answer, it's just an emphatic yes. It's we need other people.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to ask this question from Julian Rose. He's saying, he's typing fast to get this out. So many of the speakers presented us with scenarios in which an expectation, either an experience or a dream or an image of lightness, is underpinned by a dark reality of heaviness. And this automatically casts heaviness as a negative trait. So I'm wondering about a different scenario where a very frank reality of lightness perhaps presents heaviness in a more positive light. I'm thinking of the lightness of capitalism, and of course of Marx's famous lamentation that all that is solid melts into air. I was struck that no one raised this Marxist conception of lightness, and would be curious to hear your thoughts, and the other speakers, not mine, I'm going to put it on them, on whether this casts heaviness in a new light. Is there an expert of Marxism here? I see that you are shaking your head. No. Yeah. Sonam? No? Yeah.
But I thought you beautifully framed the entire salon this way, right? With the dialectic of lightness and the virtues of having our feet firmly on the ground through meaning and interpretation. And
but Julian wants us to talk about capitalism. I'm not equipped to do so. Is anybody here? Julian, we're going to study and get back to you with an answer. I'm so sorry that. So we go to another question in the audience. In the meantime, I study the next question. No, is there? Yeah. A microphone here. Thank you.
Yeah. There was a lot of references to Buddhism. Taoism also might provide an interesting direction here. The gentlest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. That which has no substance enters where there is no space. I'm thinking about a lot of people here, a lot of the presentations were about stuff, but maybe it's the non-stuff. You know, in Taoist, they say we fashion clay into a bowl, but it's the space within that we use. So,
you have a question?
Yes, so my question is, and I'm thinking about things smaller, like fields. Gravity is a field, it's not a thing, you know, and I think about the work of Rupert Sheldrake and morphogenic and other kinds of fields that are being studied. The idea that you're being watched being a real identifiable thing. Sunam, I was wondering if you had any kind of input into the something that's non-physical in this in the space of lightness.
Yeah.
I want to open this up to everyone here. I think.
Yeah, also Sarah would have, I think, a lot
my God,
to say,
yeah, the last presentation.
Yeah, I know it's so much about energy but yeah, go ahead.
Please, I mean,
Sarah.
Or space, or dynamics of movement in space.
I think that your point is a very interesting one, and I think that it seems impossible to understand matter without understanding the forces that are shaping its constitution and the energies that are moving between it. And it also seems entirely impossible to me to understand something as light unless we understand it as an energy relationship. And so these relationships, I think, become constitutive if we are trying to talk about matter at all. And I think it also has to do with Sunam, your comment about how we are all together. I think that, and not simply metaphorically, I think we are dealing with each other materially and energetically all the time.
And it was also the video of the other Buddhist that was talking about that the fact that we are existing in a plane. Ariel.
One of the favorite fun facts about modern physics is that all of the stuff we know of in the universe is about 3% of what we think actually exists, and yet we call the other 97% dark matter and dark energy. Maybe we should call it light matter and light energy, because we don't really know if it's heavy and massive like the stuff. I think it's a wonderful question. Where is all the not stuff of lightness?
Okay, we have one more question. Yeah, over here.
Thanks. Sarah, this one's for you. Your older work, the switches specifically, orient around bearings, and then it sort of moved over to kind of the screw, which we saw in some of the videos. Are you attempting to make a catalogue of these kind of manipulating devices? Are you graduating to another type of mechanism, or are you still working with the screw?
I'm actually currently working with pneumatic systems. So, air.
So I have a question that comes from the ether for Glausio. So the question is, do you ever find that the practical, impactful applications of your line of work are taken less seriously because of origami is typically a light and playful art form?
Yeah, very interesting question. Actually, we will answer this question with one example. From 2009 until 2011, I worked at the National Science Foundation. And there was a program there that was called EFRI, Emerging Frontiers for Research and Innovation. Then we start with about 100 topics, and then at the end they select one or two. And we proposed the origami topic for the EFRI program. And remember, this is a program from the federal government. What society thinks and so on plays a big role. And the process took about 1 year. For the entire year, we were always on the hot seat defending our ideas. And every meeting for 1 year, I would say this is the last one, because we start with 100 topics, 90, 80, you keep reducing until you narrow down to 2 or 3 topics. And for 1 year, I always thought that this would be the last meeting, but at the end, this topic was approved, and if you do a Google search in Google Scholar, look at the research in origami engineering, science, technology, medicine, biophysics, physics, astrophysics, biology, molecular biology, DNA folding, RNA, and so on, between 2009 and after 2009. And you can see a big distinction. Mm-hmm. So origami is an emerging field, is very pervasive, has applications in any field you can imagine. And finally, I also could mention that if you are interested, next month there will be the OSMI, the Origami in Science, Math, and Education Conference that is called the Olympic Games in Origami. Is every 4 years. Of course, the pandemic disturbed this, but it will be next month in Australia, quite far.
Okay. Well, and this is like the perfect way to close, because this sense of lightness as being serious and or trivial, as being a prison or a liberation, and anyway, as being part of our essence as human beings, I hope will remain with you, metaphor and practicalities alike. And I would like to thank this wonderful panel of speakers and to thank... And I would like to thank, as always, Christina, and I would like to thank also the people that sent questions from the overflow room and from online, from the YouTube live stream. And I would like to thank you for coming tonight. As usual, we have our so-so wine and soggy snacks outside. This time, they're going to be augmented by the MoMA Staff Art Show, which is once a year, and it's kind of a gem. And let's go outside so we're stop being so cold. And thank you so much for coming. It's chilly. Thank you.